There is an unspoken rule in the criminal underworld. Never let your enemies know what you care about. Kalen Romano, the ruthless architect of the Boston Syndicate, broke that rule the moment he looked at Daisy. He knew his reality was stained with blood, so he gave her a strict ultimatum: run and never look back. He warned her to stay away, convincing himself it was to keep her breathing. But when he kicked in her apartment door and found nothing but shattered glass and her silver necklace abandoned on the hardwood floor, the rules vanished. Kalen didn't just break the underworld's laws, he set the entire city on fire to get her back. The bitter wind coming off Boston Harbor had a way of slicing straight through a winter coat, but Daisy Hayes barely felt the cold. At 28, Daisy was a trauma nurse at Memorial Hospital by day, and by night, she was something far more dangerous, a secret lifeline for the city's underbelly. She didn't do it for the thrill. She did it because her younger brother Leo had racked up $50,000 in gambling debts with the wrong people. To keep Leo's legs from being broken, Daisy spent her Thursday nights in a damp, poorly lit basement beneath a defunct butcher shop in the North End, stitching up men who couldn't afford to walk into a public emergency room. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when the heavy steel door of the basement clinic groaned open. Daisy was wiping down a stainless steel tray, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing like an angry hornet above her head. 3 men stepped into the room. 2 were built like freight trains, their dark overcoats dripping with freezing rain. Between them, leaning heavily but refusing to completely surrender his weight, was Kalen Romano. Everyone in Boston knew the name Romano. They were the undisputed kings of the docks, the unions, and the underground casinos. Kalen, the reigning head of the family after his father's violent demise 3 years prior, was a ghost to the public, but a god to the street. He was 34, with sharp, aristocratic features cut from pale stone, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, and a tailored charcoal suit that was rapidly turning a sickening shade of black on the left side. "Put him on the table," Daisy ordered, her voice completely devoid of the panic she felt spiking in her chest. "Watch your tone, sweetheart," one of the heavy-set men growled, his hand resting instinctively on the bulge beneath his coat. Kalen raised a single blood-stained hand, silencing the man instantly. Even with a bullet in his shoulder, Kalen commanded the room. He eased himself onto the metal examination table, his dark eyes locking onto Daisy. They were eyes that had seen the worst of humanity, cold and unyielding. Yet as Daisy approached with her trauma shears to cut away his ruined suit jacket, she saw a flicker of raw, predatory intellect analyzing her every move. "You're shaking, nurse," Kalen murmured. His voice was a low, rough baritone, entirely too calm for a man leaking blood onto cheap linoleum. "I'm not shaking," Daisy lied, applying immediate pressure to the gunshot wound just below his collarbone. "I'm freezing. This basement doesn't have central heating, and you're bleeding all over my sterile field." A faint, humorless smirk touched the corner of Kalen's mouth. "My apologies for the inconvenience. The Rossi family was lacking in their hospitality tonight." Daisy went to work. She numbed the area, her hands moving with practiced mechanical precision. She dug the 9mm slug out of his muscle, clamping the bleeders and suturing the torn tissue. Through the entire agonizing process, Kalen didn't make a sound. He just watched her. He watched the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, the stray lock of auburn hair that kept falling into her eyes, and the absolute lack of judgment in her clinical touch. She didn't ask questions. She didn't cower. "You're too good for this basement," Kalen said quietly as she wrapped a thick pressure bandage around his shoulder. "And you're too wealthy to be getting shot in alleys. Yet here we are," Daisy fired back, stripping off her bloody latex gloves and tossing them into a biohazard bin. She turned to the sink to wash her hands, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of his stare burning into her back. Kalen stood up. He swayed for a fraction of a second before his iron will forced his body into rigid stillness. He buttoned his ruined shirt with one hand, tossing a thick stack of $100 bills onto the metal tray. "Keep the change," Kalen said. Daisy looked at the money, easily 10 grand, and then back at him. "The arrangement is a flat fee, Mr. Romano. This is too much." Kalen stepped closer. The scent of rain, gunpowder, and expensive sandalwood cologne washed over her. He was suddenly entirely too close, his towering frame dwarfing her. He reached out, his uninjured hand brushing the stray lock of hair away from her face. The touch was agonizingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he represented. Listen to me very carefully, Daisy, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a deadly, intimate whisper. He had read her name tag. Do not be here when I come back. Do not be in this basement. Do not walk these streets after dark. And do not ever cross my path again. A man like me is a plague. If you get too close, my world will swallow you whole, and there won't be anything left to bury. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked out into the freezing rain, his men trailing behind him, leaving Daisy alone in the deafening silence of the basement, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. 3 weeks passed. Daisy did exactly what she was told. She quit the underground clinic, using the $10,000 Kalen had left behind to pay off the final installment of Leo's debt. She changed her shifts at the hospital to daylight hours, kept her head down, and tried to erase the memory of the Mafia boss with the cold eyes and the gentle touch. But staying away from Kalen Romano in Boston was like trying to hide from the weather. Kalen, despite his own warnings, found that he couldn't eradicate Daisy Hayes from his mind. He was a man built on discipline and control, a man who viewed emotional attachments as fatal liabilities. His ongoing war with Victor Rossi, a flamboyant, chaotic rival who wanted control of the shipping ports, required his absolute, undivided attention. Yet, in the quiet, dark hours of the morning, Kalen found himself sitting in the back of his armored SUV, parked 2 blocks away from Daisy's South Boston apartment, just to make sure her living room light turned off safely. He had his second-in-command, Dante Russo, run a full background check on her. Dante, a cynical, battle-hardened man with a facial scar that ran from his ear to his jaw, had tossed the manila folder onto Kalen's mahogany desk with a heavy sigh. "She's clean, Kalen," Dante had said, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. "No criminal record, good credit, volunteers at an animal shelter. She paid off her idiot brother's markers and got out of the North End clinic. She's a civilian. A nice, normal civilian. Let her stay that way." Kalen had stared at the photograph, clipped to the file, a candid shot of Daisy laughing, holding a cup of coffee. "I warned her away, Dante. Then why do I have 2 of our best men watching her apartment building in 12-hour shifts?" Dante challenged, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Victor Rossi is getting bolder. He hit another one of our warehouses last night. You need to focus. If Rossi even sniffs out that you have a soft spot for a redheaded nurse, he will use her to gut you." "Rossi will never know she exists," Kalen replied, his voice like cracking ice. "But control is an illusion, especially when gravity is involved." It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Daisy was sitting in a rundown, neon-lit diner at the edge of the financial district, nursing a cold cup of black coffee and reviewing medical charts. The bell above the diner door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the jukebox. Daisy didn't look up until she felt the sudden, terrifying shift in the room's atmosphere. The few other patrons suddenly went perfectly still. The waitress stopped wiping down the counter. Daisy raised her eyes. Kalen was sliding into the vinyl booth opposite her. He wore a black cashmere overcoat, the collar turned up against the damp chill. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes speaking of sleepless nights and relentless violence. Yet the intensity radiating from him pinned Daisy to her seat. "I thought I told you to stay away from me," Kalen said softly. Daisy felt a spark of indignant anger flare up through her fear. "You sat at my table, Mr. Romano, in a public diner. I'm just trying to drink my coffee." Kalen leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "My men tell me you've been working doubles. You look tired, Daisy." "Your men?" Daisy's breath hitched. "You're having me followed?" "I'm having you protected," Kalen corrected, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were nervously gripping her pen. "Victor Rossi is unstable. The city is bleeding right now. I needed to know you weren't caught in the crossfire." "I don't need your protection," Daisy whispered, looking around nervously. "I'm not part of your world. You said it yourself, you're a plague." "I am," Kalen agreed, the admission heavy with a bitter, unspoken sorrow. "I am poison, Daisy. Everything I touch turns to ash. I came here tonight to look at you one last time, to convince myself that you are real, and that there is still something clean left in this city." He reached across the scarred formica table. Daisy knew she should pull her hand away, but she was paralyzed by the profound vulnerability in the eyes of a man feared by thousands. Kalen's fingers brushed against her knuckles. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Go home, Daisy," he murmured, his thumb lightly stroking the back of her hand. "Lock your doors, and pray to God you never see my face again." He stood up, dropped a $100 bill on the table to pay for her $3 coffee, and walked out into the rain. Daisy watched his dark silhouette disappear into the night, her heart aching with a bizarre, terrifying realization. She was falling for the devil, and the devil was actively trying to save her from himself. For 2 months, the fragile, invisible thread connecting Kaylin and Daisy held tight, trembling under the weight of the underworld's escalating war. Kaylin stayed away, true to his word, but the invisible shield he placed around her remained. Daisy felt it, the dark sedan parked down the street, the stranger who always seemed to be walking a few paces behind her when she left the hospital late at night. Instead of feeling trapped, it made her feel dangerously safe. But Victor Rossi was not a man who operated on strategy. He operated on chaos and informants. And in a world built on dirty money, loyalty always had a price tag. It was a Friday night. The snow was falling in thick, heavy clumps, blanketing Boston in a deceptive layer of pristine white. Kaylin was in the back room of his private club, the Obsidian, washing blood off his knuckles into a porcelain sink. Dante stood in the doorway, his face grim. They had just extracted a confession from one of Rossi's lieutenants. "Rossi knows," Dante said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual cynical edge. Kaylin froze, the water running over his bruised hands turning a pale, watery pink. He slowly turned off the faucet. He didn't ask what Rossi knew. He already felt the cold dread pooling in his stomach. "One of the guards we hired to watch her apartment complex," Dante continued, stepping into the room. "Rossi bought him out 3 days ago. He told Rossi about the nurse. Told him that Kaylin Romano has 2 hitters watching a civilian girl in Southie." Kaylin bypassed the towel, walking straight past Dante. "Get the cars. Now." "Kaylin, wait. I said get the cars!" Kaylin roared, the disciplined facade shattering completely. 10 miles away, Daisy was in her apartment, humming quietly as she chopped vegetables for a late dinner. The television was murmuring in the background. It was a perfectly ordinary, peaceful evening. Until the lights went out. Daisy stopped, the knife hovering over the cutting board. The sudden silence was deafening, save for the howling wind rattling the window panes. She waited for the hum of the refrigerator to kick back in, but the darkness remained absolute. A chill crept up her spine, primal and sharp. She reached for her phone on the kitchen counter, her fingers trembling slightly. She unlocked the screen, the bright light blinding her for a second. She dialed the only number she had memorized besides her brother's burner number Kaylin had slipped into her coat pocket weeks ago with strict instructions to use it only if she was in mortal danger. It rang twice before a voice barked. "Daisy." "Kaylin," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "The power just went out in my building. Just my building." And I heard something in the hallway. "Listen to me." Kaylin's voice was sharp, urgent, commanding. The sound of a powerful engine revving in the background roared through the speaker. "Do not speak. Walk to your bedroom, lock the door, and get into the closet. I am 3 minutes away." "Daisy, do you hear me?" 3 minutes. Hold on." "Kaylin, I'm scared," she breathed. "I know, Tesoro. I'm coming. Lock the door." Daisy took a step toward the hallway. Crack. The solid oak of her front door splintered inward with a violent, deafening crash. Daisy screamed, dropping the phone. Heavy boots crunched over the broken wood. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness of her apartment, sweeping over the living room and locking onto her terrified silhouette in the kitchen. "Well, well," a mocking, heavily accented voice sneered from the darkness. "The boss was right. Romano does have excellent taste." "No!" Daisy lunged for the kitchen knife, but a massive hand grabbed her hair, violently jerking her backward. She fought wildly, kicking and clawing, but a heavy cloth, reeking of chemical sweetness, was clamped brutally over her nose and mouth. Daisy thrashed, her vision blurring at the edges as the chloroform invaded her lungs. The last thing she heard before the darkness dragged her under was the faint, tinny voice of Kaylin screaming her name from the dropped cell phone on the floor. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, 4 black SUVs slammed to a halt outside the apartment building, tires screeching against the frozen pavement. Kaylin didn't wait for his men. He was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, his 1,911 pistol drawn, sprinting up the stairs to the 3rd floor. He rounded the corner and the breath was knocked from his lungs. The door to apartment 3B was off its hinges, leaning drunkenly against the wall. Kaylin stepped inside, the barrel of his gun sweeping the shadows, but the suffocating silence told him everything he needed to know. Daisy, he said, the name tearing from his throat. He found the kitchen in disarray. The cutting board was knocked over, vegetables scattered across the linoleum, and there, lying near the baseboards, was her cell phone. Beside it, gleaming under the beam of Kaylin's tactical flashlight, was the delicate silver necklace she wore every day the chain snapped. Dante stepped into the apartment behind him, his gun raised, flanked by 3 heavily armed men. Dante looked at the wreckage, then at Kaylin. Kaylin slowly knelt. He picked up the broken silver necklace. The metal was still cold. He closed his fist around it, the jagged edges of the broken chain biting deep into his palm until a single drop of blood hit the floor. When Kaylin Romano stood up and turned to face his men, the disciplined, calculating syndicate boss was gone. The man standing in the ruined kitchen was a monster, unleashed and devoid of mercy. His eyes, usually cool and guarded, burned with a terrifying, apocalyptic rage. "Dante," Kaylin said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadened whisper that made the armed men in the room shiver. "Yeah, boss. Call every man on our payroll. Empty the armories. Lock down the ports, the highways, and the train stations. No one gets in, and no one gets out." Kaylin walked past them, stepping over the shattered door, his voice echoing in the hallway like a death knell. "Burn the Rossi family to the ground," Kaylin commanded. "Burn their clubs, burn their warehouses, tumble the entire goddamn city if you have to. I don't care who gets in the crossfire. Find her." By 3 a.m., the Boston skyline was glowing with the dull, angry orange of structural fires. The police scanners, usually a chaotic symphony of petty thefts and traffic stops, were dead silent. The precinct captains on Kaylin Romano's payroll had ordered their cruisers to the city's perimeter, leaving the dark arteries of the industrial districts wide open. The beast had been unleashed, and the law was turning a blind eye. Kaylin stood on the rain-slicked pavement of the Seaport district, the icy wind tearing at his unbuttoned overcoat. Before him, the crown jewel of Victor Rossi's illegal import empire, a massive, corrugated steel warehouse, was violently consumed by flames. The heat blistered the paint on the parked cars 50 yards away. Dante stood beside him, the dancing firelight casting demonic shadows across his scarred face. They had taken the warehouse in less than 10 minutes, executing Rossi's guards and torching millions of dollars in smuggled narcotics and weaponry. But Kaylin felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Every second that ticked by was a second Daisy was breathing the same air as a monster. "That's 3, Dante reported, his voice tight. He holstered a smoking Glock 19. "We hit the Everett Casino, the Charlestown docks, and now this. Rossi's bleeding out financially, Kaylin. We've crippled his infrastructure for the next decade." "I don't care about his infrastructure," Kaylin snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp that barely sounded human. He grabbed Dante by the lapels of his jacket, pulling the larger man in close. "I want the man!" "Where is he holding her?" "We're squeezing everyone," Dante replied, unfazed by his boss's physical outburst. He knew the agony tearing Kaylin apart. The street soldiers don't know. Rossi went dark the second he grabbed the girl. He knew you'd burn the city. He's waiting for you to exhaust your men. "Get the cars," Kaylin commanded, releasing Dante and turning his back on the inferno. "We hit the safe houses next. Rip the doors off every property the Rossi family has ever leased. If they don't give me a location, break their knees. If they still don't talk, put a bullet in their heads." Across the city, far from the heat of the burning warehouse, Daisy awoke to the sharp, stinging smell of ammonia and stagnant water. Her vision swam, the edges of the room blurred by the lingering effects of the chloroform. She tried to lift her hands to rub her eyes, but cold, unforgiving steel bit into her wrists. Panic, cold and absolute, spiked in her chest. She was bound to a heavy iron chair, her arms secured behind her back, her ankles zip-tied to the chair legs. She blinked rapidly, forcing the room into focus. It was a subterranean space, the walls made of weeping, moss-covered concrete. Overhead, a single industrial halogen lamp swung on a frayed wire, casting harsh, swinging shadows. It looked like an abandoned meatpacking locker. The air was freezing, biting through her thin sweater, and the silence was suffocating. Footsteps echoed from the darkness beyond the light's reach, slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the sharp click of a silver-tipped cane against the concrete. Victor Rossi stepped into the light. He was nothing like Kaylin. Where Kaylin was cold, stoic, and dressed in minimalist dark tailoring, Rossi was a peacock of violence. He wore a maroon velvet blazer, a silk cravat, and a smile that made Daisy's blood run cold. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with slicked back dark hair and eyes that danced with a manic, unpredictable energy. "Ah, the nightingale wakes," Rossi purred, his heavy Italian accent curling around the English words. He dragged a wooden stool closer to her and sat down, resting his hands on the head of his cane. "I must admit, Miss Hayes, when my men told me Kaylin Romano had a weakness, I expected someone else. An heiress, perhaps. A runway model. Not a exhausted little nurse from Memorial Hospital." Daisy swallowed hard, tasting blood on her tongue from where she had bitten the inside of her cheek during the struggle. Her training kicked in. Assess the threat. Control your breathing. Do not show them your fear. "What do you want?" Daisy asked. Her voice shook, betraying her brave facade. Rossi chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I want what I have always wanted, my dear. The city, the ports, the crown. For 3 years, Kaylin has held my throat under his boot. He is a machine, unfeeling, unbreakable." Or so the myth went. Rossi leaned forward, the smell of expensive cologne and stale cigarette smoke washing over her. But then, a little bird whispered in my ear, "A guard your beloved Kaylin hired to watch your apartment. He told me that the Ice King of Boston spends his nights parked down your street, just watching your window. That he gutted 3 men in a North End basement because they looked at you wrong." Daisy's breath hitched. She had suspected Kaylin's protection was comprehensive, but the sheer scale of his obsession, the depth of his terrifying, unyielding focus on her, sent a jolt of something complicated through her. It wasn't just fear. It was a bizarre, tragic validation. "He warned me to stay away," Daisy whispered, more to herself than to Rossi. "And yet, here you are. The bait in the trap," Rossi smiled, standing up and smoothing his blazer. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket. "Right now, Kaylin is tearing Boston apart piece by piece. He is burning millions of dollars of my property. But it does not matter, because in exactly 1 hour, I am going to call him, and I am going to tell him that if he does not sign over the shipping unions and walk into this room entirely alone, I will send you back to him in several small, unmarked boxes." Daisy lifted her chin, finding a reserve of defiance she didn't know she possessed. "If you know anything about Kaylin Romano, you know he doesn't negotiate. If you kill me, he won't stop until you and everyone you love is dead." Rossi's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The force of the blow snapped Daisy's head to the side, her vision exploding into white stars. "He is already dead," Rossi hissed, leaning in so close she could feel his breath on her cheek. "He just doesn't know it yet. And you, sweet Daisy, are the shovel I am using to dig his grave." The burner phone in Kaylin's pocket vibrated at exactly 5 a.m. He was standing in the shattered remains of a Rossi-owned speakeasy in the Back Bay. The air was thick with the smell of spilled bourbon and gunpowder. 2 of Rossi's lieutenants were bleeding on the floor, groaning in agony, but neither had broken. Kaylin's knuckles were split and bleeding, his face a mask of terrifying, blank sociopathy. When he felt the vibration, the entire room seemed to freeze. Dante, who was reloading a magazine, stopped dead. The men standing guard at the doors turned their heads. Kaylin pulled the cheap plastic phone from his coat. He pressed the green button and raised it to his ear. He didn't speak. "Look at the city, Kaylin," Rossi's voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with smug satisfaction. "You throw a wonderful temper tantrum. It's almost theatrical." "Rossi," Kaylin said. His voice was deathly quiet. It wasn't a shout. It was a promise of absolute annihilation. "If she is harmed, if she is bruised, if a single hair on her head is broken, I will keep you alive for a month while I peel the skin from your bones." "Such poetry," Rossi laughed. "She is fine. A little frightened, a little bruised, but breathing. For now. But the sun is coming up, Kaylin, and I am growing bored. Name your price." "The waterfront," Rossi said instantly, his tone hardening into pure business. "The union contracts, the deed to the pier, 4 warehouses, and your complete withdrawal from the North End. I want the paperwork signed and brought to me." "Where?" "The old Chelsea meatpacking plant. Sublevel 3. You have 45 minutes. And Kaylin, you come alone. If I see a single shadow that doesn't belong to you, if I hear the engine of a car I don't recognize, I put a bullet in her brain and dissolve her in a vat of industrial lye. Do you understand? I'll be there, Kalen said, and hung up. He stared at the black screen of the phone for a long moment. The silence in the ruined bar was absolute. It's a kill box, Dante said softly, stepping up beside him. The Chelsea plant is a fortress. Sub-level 3 has only one entrance and one exit. He has his entire remaining crew down there. If you walk in alone, you don't walk out. I know, Kalen said. He holstered his 1,911 and turned to Dante. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope containing the deeds and the union transfer contracts. He had kept them on his person since the moment Daisy was taken, knowing this was exactly what Rossi would demand. Kalen, you can't, Dante argued, his voice rising in desperation. He grabbed Kalen's arm. We can breach the facility. We have tactical gear, explosives. We can flood the tunnels with tear gas. And in the crossfire, she dies, Kalen interrupted, his eyes locking onto Dante's. The sheer depth of the sorrow and conviction in Kalen's gaze made Dante release his grip. She is a civilian, Dante. She stitches up gang members in basements to save her idiot brother. She volunteers at animal shelters. She is pure, and I dragged her into hell. I am not letting her die for my sins. Kalen adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor suddenly calm, the frantic rage replaced by a chilling, fatalistic peace. You are the head of the family now, Dante. If I do not walk out of that plant by 6:30 a.m., you level the building. You bury Rossi under 10,000 tons of concrete. Understand? Dante's jaw tightened. He looked at the man he had bled for, fought for, and killed for over the last 10 years. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. I understand, boss. The drive to Chelsea was a blur of rain and neon lights. Kalen drove his matte black SUV alone, the radio off, the silence inside the cabin pressing against his eardrums. He pulled up to the rusted chain-link fence of the abandoned plant at 5:40 a.m. The sky was just beginning to turn a bruised, sickly purple. He stepped out into the freezing rain. He left his gun on the passenger seat. He left his knives in the glove compartment. He wore only his suit, his overcoat, and the envelope tucked into his breast pocket. He walked through the rusted gates, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He entered the main building, a cavernous, echoing shell of rotting wood and rusted machinery. He found the freight elevator shaft, the doors pried open, revealing a heavy metal staircase descending into the abyss. He walked down. The air grew colder, smelling of rot and old blood. When he reached the bottom, a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. Light spilled from the crack. Kalen didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open and stepped into the slaughterhouse. 30 guns racked simultaneously. The room was massive, the walls lined with Rossi's heavily armed soldiers. In the center of the room, sitting under a harsh, swinging light, was Daisy. Kalen's heart stopped. She was bruised, her lips split and bleeding, her auburn hair tangled. But when she lifted her head and her eyes met his, the sheer relief and terror he saw in them nearly brought him to his knees. Kalen, she gasped, her voice trembling. I'm here, Tesoro, Kalen said softly, never breaking eye contact with her. I'm right here. You're going to be okay. How touching, Victor Rossi sneered, stepping out from behind Daisy. He pressed the barrel of a polished silver revolver against Daisy's temple. Daisy flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. The King of Boston, walking into the slaughter like a lamb. Strip his coat. Check him. 2 men rushed forward. They aggressively patted Kalen down, ripping his overcoat off and tossing it to the wet floor. They found nothing. He's clean, boss, one of the men grunted. I have the papers, Kalen said, slowly reaching into his suit jacket. The 30 guns aimed at him twitched. He pulled out the envelope and tossed it onto the concrete floor between them. The ports, the unions, everything. It's yours. Let her go. Rossi laughed, a sharp, echoing sound. He didn't even look at the envelope. Oh, Kalen, you disappoint me. Did you really think this was a business transaction? Did you really think I would let you walk out of here alive to rebuild and come after me again? Rossi cocked the hammer of the revolver against Daisy's head. The metallic click echoed like a bomb in the silent room. This isn't an exchange, Romano. Rossi smiled, his eyes alight with victorious madness. This is an execution. But I am a merciful man. I will let you choose. Do I shoot her first, so you have to watch her die? Or do I shoot you first, so she knows it was her fault? Kalen looked at the guns surrounding him. He looked at Rossi's manic grin, and then he looked at Daisy. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. Instead, Kalen Romano did something that chilled Victor Rossi to the bone. Kalen smiled. "You talk too much, Victor," Kalen whispered, and the lights in the subterranean vault instantly cut to pitch black. The darkness wasn't merely an absence of light. It was a sudden physical weight that crushed the oxygen out of the room. The subterranean slaughterhouse plunged into an absolute suffocating void. The arrogant, rattling laughter of Victor Rossi caught violently in his throat, replaced by a sharp, panicked intake of breath. For 3 terrifying seconds, there was nothing but the sound of 30 men simultaneously realizing they were trapped underground with the most lethal predator in New England. Then, the envelope Kalen had tossed onto the floor detonated. It wasn't a fragmentation grenade. Kalen wasn't going to risk a stray piece of shrapnel hitting Daisy. It was a military-grade, synchronized flashbang, specifically designed for enclosed, subterranean tactical breaches. A blinding, apocalyptic sphere of white light erupted from the concrete floor, instantly accompanied by a deafening concussive crack that registered at 170 decibels. The sound shattered the eardrums of every man staring at the center of the room. Agonized screams echoed off the weeping concrete walls as Rossi's heavily armed soldiers dropped their weapons, clutching their bleeding ears and tearing at their blinded eyes. Kalen, however, had closed his eyes and covered his ears a fraction of a second before the blast. He had walked into the room knowing the exact geometry of the space, memorizing the distance between the steel beams, the curvature of the blood-stained floor, and exactly how many paces it would take to reach the chair. Before the echo of the blast even began to fade, Kalen was moving. He didn't need to see. He was a creature born in the shadows of this city. 3 massive, driving strides brought him to the metal chair. His hands, rough and calloused, found Daisy in the pitch black. She was trembling violently, entirely disoriented by the blast, but Kalen's grip was an anchor. "Breathe, Daisy," he commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. He pulled a serrated tactical blade from the lining of his trousers, the one place Rossi's men hadn't dared to search the boss of the Romano family. With 3 precise, brutal slashes, the zip ties and heavy ropes binding her wrists and ankles were severed. Kalen hauled her up against his chest. She buried her face into his ruined shirt, her hands frantically gripping his shoulders. "I have you," he whispered. Across the room, the backup emergency generators of the 1920s-era plant violently kicked in. The red, strobing emergency lights bathed the slaughterhouse in a hellish, crimson glow. The room was utter chaos. Men were blindly firing assault rifles into the ceiling and the walls, terrified of the shadows. Victor Rossi was on his knees, his hands covering his face, screaming for his men to shoot the center of the room. But Kalen and Daisy were no longer in the center. Kalen had dragged her behind a massive, rusted industrial meat grinder, pulling an abandoned Glock 19 from the grip of a convulsing guard on the floor. "Kalen!" Rossi shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria as his vision slowly began to return in the red strobe lights. "You're dead! You hear me? I have the exits covered! I have the feds on my payroll." Rossi staggered to his feet, wildly pointing his silver revolver into the shadows. From behind a concrete pillar, a man in a tactical vest stepped out, raising an assault rifle. It wasn't a mob soldier. The bold yellow letters on his vest read FBI. It was William Sterling, a corrupt senior agent of the Boston Organized Crime Task Force. Rossi hadn't just bought street thugs. He had bought the federal government to ensure Kalen's empire was dismantled legally if the bullets failed. "Drop the weapon, Romano!" Agent Sterling screamed, his rifle panning the room. "You're surrounded! I have an HRT unit sitting 3 blocks away. You kill Rossi, and I'll make sure you get the needle, and the girl goes away for aiding and abetting a domestic terrorist." Daisy gasped, looking up at Kalen. "Federal agents? Kalen, what do we do?" Kalen looked down at her, his eyes devoid of fear. He gently brushed a thumb over her bruised cheekbone. "I told you, Tesoro. I warned you that my world was a plague. But I also told Dante that if I didn't walk out of here by 6:30 a.m., he was to bury this building." He checked the glowing dial of his Rolex. It was 6:28 a.m. "Cover your ears, Daisy. Open your mouth slightly so the pressure doesn't burst your drums," Kalen instructed, wrapping his body around hers entirely, shielding her with his back to the walls. "What?" Rossi yelled, straining to hear Kalen's low voice over the groaning alarms. "What are you doing?" "I don't negotiate with dead men, Victor." Kalen's voice boomed, carrying a terrifying, fatalistic calm across the slaughterhouse. And I don't leave my heart in a cage. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the ground beneath them ceased to be solid. Dante hadn't waited 3 blocks away. He hadn't brought cars. He had spent the last hour navigating the forgotten Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels that ran directly beneath the Chelsea plant, packing the main load-bearing support columns of Sub-Level 3 with military-grade C4 explosives. The detonation didn't just shake the room, it ruptured the earth. The northern wall of the subterranean vault blew inward in a catastrophic storm of concrete, twisted rebar, and ash. The concussion threw Agent Sterling against the far wall, snapping his neck instantly. Rossi's remaining men were swept away by a tidal wave of pulverized stone and suffocating dust. The heavy steel ceiling groaned, bowing inward under the weight of the massive industrial building above them. Sparks rained down like hellfire as the electrical grid finally surrendered. Through the gaping, smoking crater in the wall, tactical flashlights pierced the dust. Dante Russo stepped through the rubble, an assault rifle strapped to his chest, his scarred face covered in a thick layer of gray ash. Behind him stood 20 of the Romano family's most lethal enforcers. "Clear the room!" Dante roared over the collapsing infrastructure. "Find the boss!" Kalen stood up from behind the rusted machinery, lifting Daisy securely into his arms. She clung to him, coughing against the thick dust, but she was whole. She was alive. Victor Rossi lay pinned beneath a fallen steel beam, his legs crushed. He was coughing blood, desperately clawing at the concrete as Dante's men surrounded him. He looked up, his terrified eyes locking onto Kalen as the Mafia boss walked slowly toward him. Daisy held safely against his chest. "Kalen." Rossi choked out, blood bubbling past his lips. "The feds, they know. If you kill me, there is no place on this earth you can hide." Kalen didn't blink. He didn't offer a final, poetic villain speech. He simply looked at Dante and gave a single, curt nod. Dante raised his sidearm and put a bullet between Victor Rossi's eyes. "Let's go home, boss," Dante said, lowering the weapon. "The ceiling is coming down." "No," Kalen replied, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the chaos of the collapsing room. He looked at Dante, and then he looked down at Daisy, whose eyes were wide, taking in the absolute, brutal reality of the man holding her. "I'm not going home." The escape through the underground smuggling tunnels was a blur of darkness, freezing water, and the echoing, groaning collapse of the Chelsea meatpacking plant behind them. When they finally broke the surface, emerging into the icy, rain-swept air of a forgotten shipyard near the Mystic River, the sun was just beginning to claw its way over the Boston skyline. The city was battered. Plumes of black smoke rose from the Southie docks, the seaport, and the North End. Kalen had literally set his own kingdom on fire to scorch the earth around the woman in his arms. Dante led them to a waiting, unmarked black SUV parked in the shadows of a rusted crane. Kalen set Daisy gently into the passenger seat. He didn't close the door immediately. He stood there, the freezing rain washing the blood and ash from his face, looking at her. "You're safe now," Kalen said, his voice stripped of the cold, commanding edge of the mob boss. He sounded exhausted. He sounded human. "Dante will take you to a private airfield. There is a jet waiting. It will take you to London or Paris or anywhere you want to go. You will have new identification and enough money in a Swiss account that neither you nor Leo will ever have to work again." Daisy stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What about you?" Kalen looked away, staring out at the burning city he had ruled with an iron fist. "Agent Sterling is dead in that rubble. The FBI will tear this city apart looking for the man who killed a federal task force leader. The Romano family is going to war with the United States government. I cannot be near you, Daisy. If I am with you, you will never stop running." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy gold ring, the signet ring of the Romano family, passed down from his grandfather. He turned to Dante, who was standing quietly in the rain. Kalen held out the ring. Dante's eyes widened. "Kalen, no. You're the boss. You're the king of this city. You don't walk away from the throne." "There is no throne, Dante. There's just a graveyard," Kalen said softly. "You kept your word tonight. You came for me. The men respect you. The infrastructure is yours. Take it underground. Let the feds chase a ghost." Dante looked from the ring to Kalen and then to Daisy, sitting bruised but unbroken in the car. He understood. The ruthless, untouchable Kalen Romano had finally found a vulnerability he couldn't armor against. Slowly, Dante reached out and took the ring. "You're a dead man, Kalen," Dante whispered, a fierce loyalty burning in his eyes. "The world thinks you died in that collapse. Make sure they keep thinking that," Kalen replied. He turned back to Daisy. He rested his hands on the frame of the open car door. "Goodbye, Daisy. Forgive me for dragging you into the dark." He began to pull the door shut. Daisy's hand shot out, her fingers wrapping desperately around his bloodied wrist. Kalen froze. "I spent my whole life fixing broken things in basements, Kalen," Daisy said, her voice shaking but carrying an undeniable fierce strength. "I paid off my brother's debts. I played by the rules. And where did it get me? Kidnapped, beaten, and waiting to die." She pulled him closer, forcing him to look into her eyes. "You told me you were a plague. You told me you would swallow me whole. But when the lights went out, you were the only thing that kept me breathing. You burned your entire life to the ground for me." Daisy. "Get in the car," she commanded, her voice echoing the same authority she used in the trauma ward. "I am not going to Paris alone. I am not running from the dark anymore. I am going with the man who commands it." Kalen stared at her. For the first time in his 34 years of a violent, calculated existence, the great architect of the Boston Syndicate was entirely speechless. He looked at the fierce, unwavering devotion in the eyes of the trauma nurse, and the last remnants of the Ice King melted away. Without another word, Kalen walked around the front of the SUV and slid into the driver's seat. He started the engine. The powerful roar of the motor drowned out the sirens, wailing in the distance. Dante stepped back into the shadows of the shipyard, watching as the black SUV peeled out onto the wet pavement, disappearing into the heavy morning fog. 6 months later, the FBI officially closed the file on the Chelsea meatpacking collapse, ruling the deaths of Victor Rossi, Agent William Sterling, and the elusive crime boss Kalen Romano as a catastrophic gangland dispute that ended in mutual destruction. The Boston underworld shifted, quieted under the new, disciplined rule of Dante Russo. But 1,000 miles away, in the quiet, rugged wilderness of the Teton Range in Wyoming, a different story was being written. A secluded, sprawling timber frame cabin sat at the edge of a crystal-clear glacial lake, miles from the nearest paved road. The nearest town only knew the occupants as Jonathan and Sarah Miller, a wealthy, quiet couple who paid for their groceries in cash and kept to themselves. It was twilight. The air was crisp and smelling of pine. Daisy stepped out onto the heavy wooden deck, wrapping a thick wool blanket tightly around her shoulders. She held 2 mugs of black coffee. She walked to the edge of the railing, leaning against the solid warmth of the man standing there. Kalen took the mug, his arm instinctively wrapping securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The brutal, tailored suits of Boston were gone, replaced by worn denim, a flannel shirt, and the rugged, peaceful exhaustion of a man who spent his days splitting wood instead of breaking bones. "The wind is picking up," Kalen murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm not cold," Daisy smiled, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. He looked down at her, his dark eyes once terrifying and cold, now entirely soft and anchored in absolute devotion. He traced the faint, faded scar on her jawline, a quiet reminder of the night the world almost ended. They had left a kingdom of blood and ash behind them, choosing exile over an empire. They were ghosts in a world that thought them dead. But as Kalen pulled Daisy closer, watching the stars ignite over the jagged mountain peaks, he knew the truth. He hadn't lost his life in the fire of Boston. He had finally found it. And that is the true price of the underworld. Kalen Romano ruled a city of shadows, but it took losing everything to realize that absolute power means nothing if you have no one to share the light with. Daisy didn't just survive the Mafia's wrath. She tamed the monster by choosing the man beneath the violence. Their story is a visceral reminder that love is never safe sometimes. It requires you to burn your past to the ground to forge a future from the ashes. What would you do? If the person you loved was trapped in a world of danger, would you risk everything to save them? Or would you walk away to save yourself? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with your fellow romance and drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more intense, real-life inspired storytelling. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a chapter. See you in the next one.